Right, good morning, gentlemen. You know why we're here today. It's for the last Canberra task, and in fact it is our final formation trip. Let's commence the brief. The crews are as advertised on the board here. Myself, Charlie Colgan, as number 1. Squadron Leader Williamson, Wing Commander Wills, number 2. Squadron Leader Waddy, Flying Officer Doodle, number 3. Call signs Magpie, Demon.
30 years after the Canberra bomber first donned the red, white and blue insignia of the Royal Australian Airforce, 3 pilots and their navigators gather in the briefing room of number 2 Squadron at Amberley. It's a briefing tinged with sadness. These 3 crews will fly the last ever operational mission of the RAAFs Canberras, a formation flyover of South East Queensland. It's the RAAF's way of farewelling the venerable Canberra, an aircraft known to the crews as Magpie, after its radio call sign. Briefing Officer John Tate will fly lead for the mission. His aircraft, codenamed Magpie Demon 1. With him will be Squadron Leader Noel Williamson in Magpie Demon 2, and Squadron Leader Dick Waddy in Magpie Demon 3.
The exercise for the day is to overfly Coolangatta and Brisbane City, Archfield, and then return to Amberley.
For 3 decades, Canberras had been returning to Amberley at the end of their missions. Towards the end of their life, they scarcely rated a glance, except from the crews who'd grown to love them. But in the early 50s, they were a sensation, the finest product of British aviation engineering. Airframe fitter Sergeant Bob Lynch is one of only a handful of serving RAAF men who remember those early days.
Oh, it was something really new, and believe it or not, very secret at one time. There was little things on this aeroplane that people weren't supposed to see. The variable incidence tailplane, for a start, was the first aircraft ever designed with that, to my knowledge, that is.
Australia's Canberras was still something of a novelty in the nation's skies when they were posted overseas for their first taste of combat. In 1958, 10 aircraft of number 2 Squadron were deployed to Butterworth in Malaya. As part of the British Commonwealth Far East Strategic Reserve, the 2 Squadron machines flew Australia's first ever jet bombing missions against communist insurgents. Those strikes against rebel staging positions continued until 1961. Whilst the 2 Squadron contingent bombed in Malaya, other Australian Canberras were involved in more peaceful operations, carrying the flag on numerous overseas operations. They visited Singapore, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Borneo and New Zealand, and made an epic eastward round-the-world flight to coincide with the independence celebrations in Nigeria.
This is Nigeria. The African giant came of age on October the 1st, 1960, when it received its independence as a member of the British Commonwealth. The RAAF men flew to Lagos, Nigeria's capital, in 3 Canberra bombers of number 82 Bomber Wing, Amberley, Queensland, and a supporting Hercules transport from number 36 Squadron, Richmond, New South Wales. Final briefings and preparations were completed. Operation Eastbound got underway. Ahead of these young men and their faithful aircraft lay 30,000 miles. They were to span 3 continents and 3 vast oceans before seeing their home base again. Operation Eastbound was to make history in more ways than one. It was one of the longest flights ever undertaken by the RAAF, and it was the first time Hercules and Canberra aircraft of any nation had combined to fly around the world.
That marathon mission went without a hitch. It was one of the foundation stones on which the Canberra's reputation for reliability was built. Squadron Leader Williamson, with 1,800 hours logged in command of Canberras, is enthusiastic about their reliability, but he admits they have given him one heartache.
When I was first learning to fly it on my first night solo, I had a total electrical failure in the aircraft at night on the way to Sydney and back, and we managed to get it on the ground in Williamtown, but we were quite concerned there that our fuel pumps weren't working and we were going to run out of fuel and the engines had quit. So that stirred me up a bit, but that was the very early days. Since then, I've had no significant emergencies. I lost an engine once in the top of Cyclone Tracy, which on the way to Darwin afterwards to take some photographs of the devastation so as they could get some maps ready to rebuild Darwin. We went through the top of the cyclone and snuffed an engine out, but once we'd cleared the cyclone and got down lower level, it lit up again quite normally.
Squadron Leader Waddy's fondest memories of the Canberra revolve around its still spectacular performance.
One day I was cruising at flight level 370, which is 37,000 feet, and a British Airways 747 came along, and he wanted to fly at that altitude, and he asked the air traffic controller for a clearance to cruise at 37,000 feet. The air traffic controller came back and said, I'm sorry, but that altitude's not available due to preceding traffic. And to which I responded and said, well, we're quite happy to vacate that altitude to allow the 747 to fly at that altitude. And the air traffic control asked us what altitude we'd accept, and we said, oh, we'll go straight to flight level 450, which is 45,000 feet. And which this very pucker British voice came back and said, flight level 450, my gosh, what are you, sir? To which I replied, I was a Canberra. And I don't think he was aware that there was an aeroplane out there with a performance that could get out of his road by going up vertically.
Yesterday's air attacks over North Vietnam were the heaviest in 3 weeks.
1967, and Australian Canberras were once again at war in Southeast Asia. 8 bombers were based at Phan Rang in South Vietnam and attached to the United States 35th Tactical Fighter Wing. The Australians soon established an enviable record for bombing accuracy on both visual and radar-guided sorties.
It was excellent. It was very stable, and we were bombing at quite low level in Vietnam, in South Vietnam itself. We had lots of very, very good results, or reported good results back from the ground people who analysed the results. They were very happy with the performance of the Canberra. It's extremely reliable. Our serviceability rate up there was in the high 90%. I don't think we ever dropped a sortie because we didn't have an aeroplane available. And with 8 aeroplanes flying 8 missions a day, most of them somewhere between 3 and 5 hours each, that was an excellent record.
There's old tiger. What's all those little flashes mean?
Little flashes, yeah, there you go.
No waving pieces of glass at us, or they're shooting at us?
Coming right, still
it's
further.
a bit bumpy. Steady it there.
Steady it there.
Steady it there.
Okay, if you got those smokes about 5 meters short of that smoke, will be real fine, and you're cleared hot.
Roger.
Left, left.
Delayed fuse, 3 bombs.
Left, left.
Roger. Delay 3
Left,
bombs.
left. Left, left.
Hang left.
Left, left.
Hang
Left, 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 left. Steady.
Steady there.
Steady there. Left, left. Steady, steady.
Steady.
Steady there. Steady there. Steady there. Looking
Steady,
good.
steady.
Steady. Steady, 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 steady. Bomb gone.
Okay. 3 away.
Roger, got 3.
Let's have a look. Should be good, should be good.
Should be good. Should be good. Yes.
They used to make a mess. Our bombs were considerably larger than a lot of the bombs that the Americans dropped. They dropped mainly 500-pounders, and we dropped 750-pound bombs. Even though it's only half as big again in weight, the damage it does is considerably greater than the 500-pounder. So yes, they used to make quite a mess.
By the late 60s and early 70s, technology was overtaking the Canberra. Dave Smith, now a pilot with the Department of Transport, logged more than 200 combat missions in the aircraft.
We found that it was lacking in sophistication when we did compare it to the American aircraft. The American aircraft used in Vietnam had a number of sophisticated electronic countermeasure type equipment which the Canberra didn't have. The Canberra was fairly antiquated in its layout, instruments, radios, and we found that towards the end of the war, this was causing a problem, because the North Vietnamese were getting more sophisticated weaponry, and they were bringing it down to in-country, that is in South Vietnam, and the Canberra as such, we really had no counter to this. We just had the pilot just had his eyeballs to look out for anything that might come his way.
Okay, Magpie, the smoke is down. It's in thick jungle. I want you to put the first bomb right on the smoke.
I'll put the bomb doors open, a bit further around.
Yeah, steady on that.
Okay, steady.
Steady on that.
Steady there.
Steady on that.
Steady.
Coming up, nearly there.
Coming up.
Nearly there. Nearly there. Bombs are gone.
Okay, doors
Got all
closed.
forward. Roger that. Forward. Outstanding. Looked like the first one hit the smoke directly, and that was real good. The second one got a tremendous explosion on it. There may have been a secondary out of there.
The last 12 months of the Canberra's operations in Vietnam, we lost 2 aeroplanes out of an effective strength of 8. And I think that speaks for itself to a large degree, in that most of the crews, pilots and navigators alike, were feeling that the enemy as such were getting the advantage over certainly the Canberra. And most crews, I feel, towards the end, when they went out on a mission, were a little apprehensive.
The first Canberra loss in Vietnam in November 1970 was one of the war's mysteries. Her crew had just completed a bombing mission and had called forward air control with a routine message. That was the last word from Canberra number 231. Neither the aircraft nor its crew was ever found. 4 months later, a Russian-built SAM-2 missile crippled another Canberra, number 228, flying at more than 3,000 meters near the demilitarized zone. Wing Commander John Downing was at the controls, with Flight Lieutenant Alan Pinchers in the navigator's seat.
There was an almighty bang, quite noisy. There was bits of paper and dust and all sorts of things floating around, and I couldn't hear anything from the pilot, so I looked around. He started speaking then that he had control of the aircraft. Just then he saw another one, and then he said the aircraft was breaking up and to get out. I got to the top of my trajectory, and just at the top I saw the pilot coming out after me, breaking through his canopy almost like in slow motion. And then all of a sudden I got thrown around with a drogue chute, quite frightening. It was very noisy and everything, by the way, when you sort of get thrown out into this. And I got thrown around. I was trying to keep my arms in. And then all of a sudden you stabilised, beautiful and quiet, and the airplane's a little bit further away. And just before you could relax it, you fall out of your seat, and all of a sudden you're just falling free. And I could see the pilot below me, and we fell for a while, and then his chute opened, and I thought that was a bit rough because mine hadn't opened either, and mine opened about a couple of seconds later. Saw the pilot's chute just start to collapse as he hit. Then I had to look to see where I was going. I only had a choice of thumping great trees or thumping great boulders, so I more or less just closed my eyes and hoped.
Alan Pinchers spent a very lonely night and most of the next day alone in Viet Cong territory before he contacted his pilot by emergency radio.
I called up once and he answered me, and here again it's a bit amusing because we'd known each other for years, but he called up and said he said, "This is the wing commander here," and I thought he could have said John or who else was it going to be, but it's funny. And yeah, it was real great, after that time, just to know that he was all right. And there was 2 of you, I think, from the time that I heard him, I knew that we were going to be right.
For just over 4 years, the aircraft called Magpies ranged over the steaming jungles of South Vietnam. They flew 12,000 combat missions, dropping 26,000 tons of bombs on bridges, bunkers and sampans. Then, in May 1971, it was all over. 2 squadrons sent the last of their 76,389 bombs on their way.
They'd painted one of the bombs all white and had an appropriate inscription painted on the side of the bomb, and a few photographs were taken and a few words were said, and we hopped in the aeroplane and off we went for the last mission, which was up north. And the forward air controller was fairly pleased with the results. I think it was an enemy bunker position of some kind, but we didn't really wait around to have a look. We just started to climb up and head back to Phan Rang, and that's when it hit home that it was all over. And when the adrenaline had stopped pumping, I thought it appropriate that we give a broadcast that nearly all Vietnam or South Vietnam could hear, and this was on the distress frequency, which normally is reserved for aircraft that experience emergencies, so that everybody listens out on this frequency and everybody can hear. But at this time I thought it appropriate that we tell the rest of South Vietnam that the Magpie, as we're known in Vietnam, that was our call sign, that the Magpies had finished in Vietnam. We'd just dropped the last bomb and we're heading back to Phan Rang, and that was it. And I was a bit overawed by the response. Just about every aircraft in South Vietnam, I think, came back with some complimentary remark, and it was very emotional at the flight home.
The reception back at Phan Rang was as emotion-charged as the flight itself, with ceremonies starting after the aircraft was ordered to halt on the taxiway.
The other members of the squadron, pilots and navigators, the other crews, came out and clambered up onto the wings on either side, and we taxied in that way to get the traditional hose down because we had finished in Vietnam, and all the Americans were there, the base commander and everybody was there, and it was quite a ceremony, a wet ceremony.
Once again, the Canberras came home to Amberley, never to bomb again. But with their huge wings and stable high-altitude performance, they were superb aerial reconnaissance machines, and it was to that task that they were turned. They helped with survey work in Australia and overseas, producing high-quality maps at a speed which ground survey parties could never hope to match. They also fulfilled a valuable fighter support role, towing targets for Mirage fighter pilots' gunnery practice. But the Canberras were running out of flying hours. Their metal structures were gradually failing, and eventually they fell victim to a cost-cutting program as the Defence Department searched for savings to pay for the aircraft carrier Invincible. When the crews for that final flypast gathered in their briefing room, the Magpies had only a few hours of life left.
Okay, gents, Magpie Demon starting at 9:30. Any questions? Let's go.
three aircraft which made up the Magpie Demon flight wheeled their way across the fields of South East Queensland as pilots refreshed themselves on the techniques of close formation flying.
They're a pilot's aeroplane. They're very demanding, they're heavy physically, and they're hard work. However, they're very, very rewarding. To fly one well is a thrill. It's a buzz. I think it's an ego trip.
At the control of Magpie Demon 2, Noel Williamson was flying his first Canberra formation in more than 4 years, and he admits it took some getting used to. But he wouldn't have missed the mission for the world. In a long Air Force career, he has fond memories of the aircraft.
I think you always remember your early days the best. I've had some pretty good times since, though. The survey work which we've done in Indonesia and New Guinea and that sort of thing has been very, very satisfying, particularly when you see the maps that the Army produce as the end product of all the photography work we did up there under some fairly tough conditions.
When it first flew in England in 1949, the Canberra was a technological marvel. It formed the frontline strike force in several air forces around the world and was built under license in the United States as the B-57. The RAAF's 50 aircraft spent an average of 6,000 hours each in the air. 2 were lost in combat, 6 more were claimed by peacetime incidents. Age had also taken its toll. On their last official day of operation, just 6 machines remained serviceable. But in 30 years of RAAF service, the Canberras had endeared themselves to 2 generations of RAAF crewmen, and their broad wings had been seen in the skies over every corner of Australia. Operation Magpie Demon was farewell. The last flight of the Magpie lasted less than an hour and a half, but it put the seal on more than 250,000 flying hours for the entire Canberra fleet. Appropriately, their welcome back at Amberley was more elaborate than normal.
I'd like to propose a toast to the Canberra. Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, to the Canberra.
To the Canberra!
Thanks very much.
It's a highly desirable posting off pilot's course. There's a lot of young guys absolutely love to get on the aeroplane because it gives you a lot of captain time and a lot of responsibility early in your Air Force career or your flying career, which you don't get on a lot of other aircraft where you've got 2 pilots and a navigator, etc. So this one, as soon as you come onto it, once you've done your conversion, it's you and the navigator and you run it, and you get a lot of freedom and a lot of satisfaction out of flying it.
I've enjoyed flying it so much over the last 6 or 8 years. In fact, I think it's close to 8 years now. That's perhaps my last flight in the Canberra. I enjoyed it, but I'm going to miss it.